Hey, May. How you doing? What are you wearing? Something skimpy, I hope.
Tony Stark and Peter Parker have one of the best relationships in the MCU with their mentor-mentee situation, but what if things were different? What if Spider-Man was recruited for Captain America's team in Civil War and Captain America became Peter's mentor? How different would the MCU look? What would the fallout be? Could Peter and Steve have as deep of a relationship as Iron Man and Spider-Man? Oh, this is going to be a fun one. Let's get into it right now.
Lordy, can you even see in these?
Yes, I can't. Look, I can't.
I'm going to start off by saying something controversial. I think it makes more sense for Steve to have recruited Peter Parker in Civil War than Tony. I mean, really? Neither of them should be recruiting a 15-year-old to go fight other Avengers with like 1 day notice. But out of the two of them, Cap does make more sense. Here's one of my problems with that whole situation. Civil War sees Tony push for heroes like the Avengers to be held more accountable and to operate with the permission from a governing body of individuals. His guilt over Sokovia is what's driving this. Steve is more of the, hey, I think we should get to decide what's right and have final say over where to go, and the two butt heads. So Tony, who is fighting Steve for defying orders, suddenly decides to go by himself on his own accord to pick up a 15-year-old and fly him to Germany to fight this battle. Isn't that the exact kind of attitude Tony is against? That the Avengers can't just do whatever they want? Look, I get it. It's not the character's decision, it's the MCU's decision. And that was the best way to get Spider-Man into the movie and in Germany. But that's always rung a little false for me. But let's flip the switch. What would make Captain America recruit Peter Parker? Well, I think that's an easy solution. If the Sokovia Accords were about the registration and deployment of superheroes, let's see how that would affect a new hero like Peter Parker. He's one of the heroes who this would have presumably been geared toward, so having an early scene in Civil War where Peter has to register and Captain America is against it could have united the two of them. Also, I know MCU Peter is not comic book Peter, but this could have been an opportunity for the MCU to take Peter's character in a different direction. Spider-Man, at least to me, is always best as a loner. He's dancing to the beat of his own drum, and having a young Peter Parker turned off by the idea of registration and then falling in with Captain America could have been an interesting development that changed everything in the MCU. But let me just briefly say that if done right, the MCU could have done things even more comic accurate. The version I just presented is quicker, but now I wonder if there was a way for the MCU to skew a little closer to the comic Civil War. Imagine if they had the time to start to develop Tony and Peter's relationship, but eventually Peter switches sides like he does in the comic to join Captain America. That actually could have been a neat little wake-up call to Tony. Like, sure, Civil War did a good job in making both sides sort of make sense, but I'm of the opinion that Steve was more right than Tony. If Tony and Peter developed a meaningful relationship only for Peter to realize that Tony wasn't fighting for the best intentions, then his switch over to Captain America could have made Tony realize that he needed to rethink what he was doing. I mean, actually, Civil War could have played out very similarly to what we got. Tony recruits Peter, Peter fights in Germany, he crosses paths with Steve Rogers, and the two realize they had similar upbringings by being true New Yorkers.
Where you from?
Queens?
Brooklyn.
And then Peter is taken out of the fight for that third act to happen, and Captain America becomes an outlaw. They could have followed this thread into Homecoming, and it would have created some interesting results. Look, I love Homecoming for its high school-based story, and there is a way to incorporate that stuff, but for this purpose, let's pretend there's more important things to focus on. To fully establish Captain America as Peter's mentor, I think you can do that in Homecoming. Because what's the one thing that Peter wants in Homecoming? It's to be an Avenger, right? He desperately wants to prove himself to Tony that he's ready for the big leagues, even though Tony continues to ghost him. In Homecoming, Peter tries to capture the Vulture by himself because he doesn't think anyone is listening to him, and this will make him stand out. But you could easily change that to where, what if Peter's adamant about hunting down Captain America? So let's say that Spider-Man was on Captain America's team in Civil War. It seems like all of those Avengers got off with some really weird sentences for rebelling, like with Ant-Man and Hawkeye on house arrest. So maybe the fact that Peter is a 15-year-old gets him off with a warning, but now he's in New York and feels guilty. He's unsure about if he did the right thing, so now Peter is adamant about capturing Captain America in order to maybe impress Tony Stark and clear his own name a little bit. And they could have some fun bits where Peter does find him hiding in New York. Again, they established that the two have similar upbringings with their New York roots, so maybe Spider-Man can use that to find Steve. Only when they do cross paths, Peter is torn about whether to turn him in or not, and Steve does continue to mentor him from there. I like putting Steve in Homecoming because it sets up two types of mentors for Peter between him and Tony, and could end with Peter realizing he needs to branch out a bit and be his own hero to decide what's right. That does call into question the Vulture's role in Homecoming though, and how much that would have to change. Because honestly, the movie that I'm describing with Peter trying to track down Captain America already seems like a lot. But this is all make-believe. Let's pretend we can do whatever we want. So now the question is, how would Vulture fit into Homecoming's story? Well, much like Zemo in Civil War, maybe Vulture could be the guy both Captain America and Iron Man are after, though both of them being on two sides of the law. And you know what? I'm liking this. Hear me out. So Civil War could have been about the hero's side of registration, and Spider-Man more on Captain America's side now. And then Homecoming could have been exploring how each side would go about capturing a dangerous criminal. Iron Man would be trying to follow protocol under the new Accords, and Captain America would be working as a rogue agent. That makes Spider-Man the wild card, and by progressing the story where Spider-Man is having better results than both Captain America and Iron Man, means that not only could Peter be learning from both Captain America and Iron Man as he's mentored by arguably both of them, but the two main Avengers are also learning from this teenage hero. I think that's the missing ingredient actually, since this way, by pushing Peter as this middle ground between Iron Man and Cap, it frames this as more of a Spider-Man story. It's not perfect, but I think there's a way to make that work. Let's pivot a second and talk about Captain America. This whole time, I've been discussing how being on Captain America's Civil War team would mainly change things for Peter and his character as he learns what he believes is right and wrong. But I feel like I should devote a little time to Captain America. If Spider-Man was Steve's mentee, then that's great for Peter. But how would that be for Captain America? What would Cap be like around a teenager who wants to be a superhero? Cap's two biggest sidekicks are the Winter Soldier and Falcon, but both are grown men who can operate independently without Captain America. They feel more like partnerships rather than the mentor-mentee setup. So what would change? For one, I think there's a lot of humor you could get from Captain America trying to relate to a teenager.
Don't you say it left. Come on!
Especially if that teenager is probably more aware of how the world works technology-wise than you are. And because Peter is smart like Tony Stark, it would allow Steve to mentor the potential next Iron Man and maybe learn more about Tony in the process. Maybe if Steve sees Peter as a mini Iron Man, then that might fix Tony and Steve's relationship faster. There's also something interesting to be said about Captain America training someone with superpowers, since both of them are powered up but from slightly different sources. The question becomes though, if Captain America becomes Spider-Man's mentor, does that affect the other relationships in his life? We know Steve and Bucky grew up together and are best friends, but would Peter intrude on that relationship at all? Same with Falcon. If Captain America had Spider-Man by his side, would that cause a little strife between Steve and Sam? Tough to say, but overall, Captain America has always been a leader, though he's mainly worked with peers. Let's see what happens if we pair him with someone who needs to learn about being a superhero. And honestly, if Peter was on Captain America's team in Civil War, it opens up a lot more potential for fun pairings that were left unexplored. I mean, I'm curious, was there room on Captain America's team for two quirky golden retrievers? Ant-Man fills that role on Captain America's team as the wide-eyed, wow, this is awesome type of character, while Spider-Man does that on Iron Man's team. What would happen if both Ant-Man and Spider-Man were on the same team?
Hey guys, you ever seen that really old movie? Empire Strikes Back?
Jesus, Tony, how old is this guy?
I know usually in the MCU, it's best to have one goofy character, one serious character, but put two goofy characters together and you got yourself a party. I think both of them would geek out over being on the Avengers, and you could have a really great scene of Scott and Peter talking about being fans of these heroes for a while, and now they're a part of it, and what that overall means.
I'm shaking your hand too long.
Wow, this is awesome.
But a pairing I would actually be really interested in is Spider-Man and Scarlet Witch. One minor nitpick about Scarlet Witch in Civil War is that she's set up as really important in the first half, as she essentially causes the conflict that sets off the Sokovia Accords, but becomes more of a utility player by the end as we shift focus to Baron Zemo, Bucky, Cap, and Iron Man. I know the movie is already super long, but I think it would have gone a long way to see Scarlet Witch interact with someone who doesn't already know her and discuss how the accident was not her fault. Yeah, seeing Clint rescue her from Vision and seeing her scenes with Vision are all great, but I think you could have gotten a little more if you paired Spider-Man with Scarlet Witch. Just an interesting new perspective. So that brings me to Infinity War, and man, that has the potential to look a lot different in this new Spider-Man and Captain America partnership. If Spider-Man has become fully Team Cap at this point, then he probably never gets the Iron Spider, right? I mean, yeah, you could make the case that he never gets the original Stark suit, which would imply that he makes his better homemade costume himself much earlier, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. But without the Iron Spider, then Peter would have fallen to Earth and stayed there during the events of the movie, right? I mean, maybe, but I like keeping Peter on the Titan mission. By making it so Peter does travel to outer space with Tony Stark and Doctor Strange, it sets up a nice conclusion to the arc set up in Civil War, where Peter had to turn against Tony to side with Cap, and now the two are fully working together. Iron Man and Spider-Man could have worked out their differences, and it's there that Tony develops his full respect for Peter. And then, just when Tony is fully in Peter's corner, that's when they lose and Peter turns to dust, which would affect Iron Man in a different way than before. He wouldn't be as devastated as he was in the OG Infinity War, but he would have to return to Captain America and tell him that his protege wasn't there with him. Then that leads us to Endgame, and if we're following this plotline, then Tony would have to return to Earth and tell Captain America, "I lost the kid." That line would carry significantly more impact because it's Captain America with the close connection to Peter now, and Tony would probably feel immense guilt of failing to protect him, and would be left with those feelings of doubt, where Tony would wonder if Captain America was in space instead of him, would Peter still be there with them? Maybe the two heroes could have another falling out over this, and it's only when Ant-Man presents his time travel theory that motivates Iron Man to fix things. Maybe it's a case of Tony having a kid now who he loves more than life itself, and realizing that Steve and Peter had a father/son-esque vibe, so Tony understands more the feeling of losing someone that close to you, and he invents time travel to help his friend Steve. Given Tony and Steve's tough relationship over all these movies, I find the idea that Tony invents time travel to help Steve out pretty satisfying. And of course, Peter would still lose a mentor at the end of the movie with Cap going back in time to be with Peggy. But now it's framed as Captain America being okay with leaving the superhero life because he knows heroes like Peter are there to continue the fight. That would help fix the issue people have with Endgame about how Steve leaving to go be with Peggy felt out of character. I think establishing that Steve trusts Peter to lead the next generation of heroes would fix that nitpick, don't you? Then Spider-Man Far From Home would be the same, but not really. That movie is all about Peter trying to be the next Iron Man before realizing he should just be Peter Parker. And this new version could be similar, with Peter trying to be the next Captain America before realizing that he needs to spend a little more time as a teenager and being his own hero, because that's what Captain America would have wanted. I mean, you could still keep Mysterio, but I wonder if you could make him not another person who hates Iron Man, but rather just a Spider-Man bad guy. Not sure if the movie would be better for that or not. I wonder if a Captain America mentor relationship would mean that Spider-Man would have shown up in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I mean, that final fight took place in New York and was pretty well publicized. It was kind of weird Peter didn't show up to assist his fellow Avengers, right? But Peter and Falcon and Winter Soldier have an interesting relationship that would have been even more fascinating if Spidey was on Cap's team and was his mentee.
You have a metal arm? That is awesome, dude.
I think Spider-Man would have had more of an opinion about who should have been the next person to hold the shield, and I could see a cameo from Peter trying to convince Sam to take it. Again, it doesn't have to be major, but for how New York that show felt at the end, it would have been perfect for a Spidey cameo. And I think you could make Spider-Man No Way Home make a little more sense as well. You know what's weird? The fact that Peter is upset that him and his friends can't get into MIT, and that's the main reason why he goes to Doctor Strange. But if he was so close with with Tony Stark, couldn't Pepper Potts just step in and convince MIT to accept them? I mean, Tony gave them a ton of money in Civil War and was their most famous alumni. Felt like a problem that could have been solved easily, but if Peter was closer to Captain America, who didn't have rich and powerful connections, the idea of his secret identity ruining his life is much more plausible. Then you could still have everything that happened in No Way Home play out mostly the same way. And that brings me to my final point about the future. Overall, what are the broader ramifications for Peter Parker on Captain America's Civil War team? Well, for starters, it would have opened the door a bit for Ironheart earlier in the MCU. Right now, Ironheart is being established as a post-Iron Man hero with Wakanda tech, which is fine because it's not like they could have done the comic-accurate storyline with her being Iron Man's mentee. But maybe they could have if Peter was with Captain America. Then it wouldn't be a rehash of the same storyline. Maybe you could have had a situation where in the 5 years between Infinity War and Endgame, Tony started to lightly mentor Riri Williams, and then you'd have parallels between Tony mentoring Riri and Steve mentoring Peter. And then with both Tony and Steve gone, it creates an interesting relationship between Ironheart and Spider-Man. Both of them would have lost their mentors and created their own special partnership for the future. Alright, I know this was a positively wild ride, but I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are regarding if the MCU could have ever pulled this off. Let me know. What if Captain America never froze? That simple change would have long-lasting repercussions to the entire MCU. If he immediately survived his icy plunge, then S.H.I.E.L.D. might have formed faster, his relationship with Bucky would be potentially more interesting, and everything we've seen from Iron Man to Endgame would be dramatically different. But is that for better or for worse? Would Steve Rogers have remained the righteous Boy Scout all those years, or would he falter the more he saw the world change around him? I'll talk about all that in today's video. Let's get started right now. Captain America would have left an unbelievable impact on the entire timeline and the overall MCU if he was never frozen in ice. And really, did he have to become a capsicle? There our hero was, cruising through the air carrying a plane's worth of sinister destruction in his first movie, and of course, Steve decides to sacrifice himself for the greater good. The Boy Scout immediately chooses to plunge the ship down to the icy depths of the Atlantic to get rid of all the dangerous cargo. But like Steve, yes, it's a split decision and it's really admirable, but you think there would be a way to insulate yourself or brace for landing a little bit better, right? Okay, even if there was no time to do anything else, then the government should have found him faster, right? I mean, they found the Tesseract pretty easily at the bottom of the ocean, and they know what direction the ginormous ship was headed, so I mean, you would think Howard would be able to track it a bit better. In my head, I always picture the government finding the cube and then just shrugging and giving their best, well, we tried, looks before giving up. And I've always thought a cool explanation would be that because Hydra infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D., that they slowly manipulated events to make the search for Steve Rogers face major hurdles. But really, that doesn't make sense in the timeline. Cool idea though. So in the movie we got, the side effect of Cap's actions is that he's frozen in ice for almost 70 years. He missed a lot of important things in his life, like the Howard the Duck movie and the time that Nick Fury was cast to play Mace Windu in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And we all know how things went. Steve went on to become the leader of the Avengers. He stood up to corruption and followed his own path, leading him to go rogue. He was reunited with his best bro Bucky, who coincidentally also became a super soldier, which, hey, small world. And then was a key part in saving the world from the Mad Titan before choosing his own happiness over the needs of the world. But what if the entire history was different? What if Cap found a way to survive his icy plunge and lived his whole life in his own time? Would he still have had his happy ending? Would it be such a large repercussion that the entire MCU timeline would have been altered, resulting in a spectacularly different chain of events? Maybe. That's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going through the idea of what if Captain America never froze and how that would fundamentally change things. I'll discuss all the stuff in the past that he would have had an effect on. I'll discuss how him being old man Steve would have affected the Avengers, and I'll discuss his relationships with those closest to him. Sounds good? Great. So let's talk about the immediate effect of Steve not freezing. The first is the formation of S.H.I.E.L.D. Well, no, I guess the first is that Steve gets to have his date with Peggy. The band would have played something slow, Peggy would have taught Steve to dance, and he would only step on her feet a little bit. Okay, but after that, the real work begins. So going forward in the original timeline, we have to discuss what's canon and what's not. For instance, it's pretty clear Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is not canon. I mean, I guess depending on who you ask. They love to dance around that issue. Like, they'll say it's not canon, but then they'll tease Chloe Bennett's Daisy Johnson having a cameo in Secret Invasion. So it's all a bit timey-wimey, different university. And then you have the Agent Carter TV show, which seems pretty canon and has been talked about being canon, but then that directly contradicts the events of the Agent Carter one-shot, so is that not canon? It doesn't really matter, I guess. Let's just say the timeline is in flux ever since He Who Remains got stabbed, so it's all simultaneously canon and not canon at the same time. Easy, right? But no matter what, we know the general gist. Peggy returned to working for the SSR, but was stuck doing administrative work because she was a woman and constantly overlooked, until she was able to showcase how awesome she was, and eventually went on to form and run S.H.I.E.L.D. with Howard Stark and Colonel Phillips sometime in the early 1950s. The first big question, if Steve was around after World War II, would S.H.I.E.L.D. have formed faster? I think it would have. Steve had successfully broken out of his poster boy mold and was an active agent in the field, so I think he would have been a catalyst for the organization to get the ball rolling. So if S.H.I.E.L.D. had formed with Cap in a leadership role, the two biggest questions are about Hydra and the Tesseract. We know that after S.H.I.E.L.D. partook in Operation Paperclip, which saw the recruitment of enemy German scientists to their own side, Arnim Zola secretly rebuilt Hydra within S.H.I.E.L.D.'s ranks. Could Steve have stopped it? Honestly, probably not. If a lot of good people like Peggy and Howard missed this happening in the OG timeline, I think it would have happened regardless if Steve was there. So Hydra may still have risen, but the Tesseract is a different story. We know from Captain Marvel and then later in the Avengers that the Tesseract was a source of fascination for S.H.I.E.L.D., who thought they could experiment on it for positive results. Where do you think Steve would have landed on this issue? We saw in the Avengers that he got tremendously mad at Nick Fury for making weapons with the Tesseract, as that's what Hydra did in World War II, but would Steve have been more on board with things like Project Pegasus, which was adamant about using the Tesseract for energy alternatives? I think it would have been tough. Steve understood that the Tesseract was a power that they didn't understand and shouldn't mess with. But I think as Steve got a little older and went through different milestones like the Cold War, he would understand that the Tesseract is a power that would need to be explored more. So those two things, I don't think Steve would have had much of an impact on, but there are two other big things that would have had major ripples in the MCU: the Super Soldier Serum and Bucky Barnes. In Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we learn that the US Army developed their own Super Soldier Serum test and used it on African Americans, namely Isaiah Bradley, who became a super soldier. We know that he was inhumanely locked away, and while I do think the Army still would have replicated the Soldier Serum without Steve's knowledge, I don't think they could have kept the new Captain America secret from Steve, and Steve would have worked hard to free Isaiah Bradley and keep him the Captain America after Steve hung up his shield. This would have been an interesting story as well. I imagine during the Korean War in the 50s, Steve would be going through a tough transition. Either he could remain a Captain America and be in the field as a soldier, or he could help lead S.H.I.E.L.D. from an executive position. With the news of Isaiah Bradley being a super soldier, this would allow Steve to hand off the S.H.I.E.L.D. to someone else and then also be in charge. Obviously, there's more complicated issues than that, but I like Steve choosing to lead rather than always being on the ground taking orders. That would be a natural progression of his character arc. And then there's Bucky. Let's talk about Bucky in the next point since it directly relates to Iron Man and the present day. Maybe the biggest change to the past timeline, if Cap never froze, would be Bucky Barnes. The Winter Soldier first started popping up in the 1950s, and if Steve was directly involved with S.H.I.E.L.D., are you telling me he never would have realized it was Bucky? Especially if Steve developed a professional relationship with Isaiah Bradley, who fought Bucky in the Korean War? I think Steve would have put the pieces together much sooner. It was pretty easy for Steve to break Bucky's brainwashing. He just had to hit him with the old "I'm with you" to the end of the line throwback, and the real Bucky started to break through. There's a lot of implications to this if Bucky was saved, but let's say that Steve saves Bucky before the 90s and essentially stops him from assassinating the Starks. Now, it feels like Hydra would have still found a way to get to Howard and Maria, so their deaths might be one of those fixed points in time, but at least Steve's relationship with Tony might be different. Steve might have been part of young Tony's life at least a little bit, but Steve could still feel responsible for their deaths and essentially cover it up to protect Tony from the harsh truth. Then Tony could have gone on his hero's journey, but now with one big difference. With old man Steve essentially a vital part of picking the Avengers for the team, he would be adamant about leaving Tony off of it. It could come across like Steve doesn't want a rogue personality like Tony on the team, a fact that's probably technically for the best, but the real reason would be that he doesn't want any harm to come to Tony under his watch after what happened with his friend Howard. So by the time the first Avengers movie rolls around, just who would be on the roster? And what would even be the threat? I still think it would be Loki. The events of Thor would still be the same, and Loki would have found a way to teleport to Earth through the Tesseract somehow, even if S.H.I.E.L.D. wasn't experimenting on it for weaponry. We just might have missed out on that cool opening scene in the Avengers, and Hawkeye might never have been brainwashed. Imagine that. Hawkeye has gone through a huge character revamp since the first Avengers movie. Everyone thought he was super uncool because of how his character was handled in that first movie, but now that he doesn't have to go through that, his whole destiny is different. Neat. So with Loki on Earth and Steve an old man, he would finally put the Avengers initiative in place. You'd definitely have Thor, who would be there for Loki. You'd have Hawkeye as potentially a team leader. Black Widow is a bit of a question mark, since wasn't she only there to begin with because Clint was brainwashed and she wanted to save him? Maybe Clint, now not brainwashed, would bring her in anyway. You'd maybe have Bruce Banner and the Hulk, like they'd bring in Banner and he'd still Hulk out. And then I also think you would have a version of Ant-Man and the Wasp. We know Hank Pym hated Howard Stark and left S.H.I.E.L.D. because of Howard's treatment of Pym particles, but with Steve there to smooth things over, could this have been avoided? Would Howard have still gone behind Hank's back to replicate those shrinking miracles? Maybe not, which means Ant-Man and the Wasp could be on the original Avengers team. And let's say Captain Marvel was too busy to join up because of space things. I think the crux of the movie could be Steve and Tony working out their differences so that Steve would let Tony be on the Avengers for real. Then the movie ends with this lineup ready to defend Earth against any major threat. After the Avengers, things get a little tricky with the events of Winter Soldier and Civil War. With Bucky already essentially redeemed, there's no need to save him, but you could still form a movie about the destruction of S.H.I.E.L.D. at the hands of Hydra. That movie was originally about Steve realizing that maybe the good guys aren't that different from the bad guys, and finding out the organization he was fighting for was compromised. You could still have that crux, only this time it's even more heavy since Steve has been fighting for S.H.I.E.L.D. for the last 70 years instead of just the last few years. Steve would have come to the conclusion that S.H.I.E.L.D. needs to be revamped and rebuilt in modern times, and it's time for him to retire from his position. He's been fighting the fight for so long that he doesn't know how to do anything else, but realizes that it's time for a big change. Age of Ultron could essentially happen the same way, but it's Civil War which would need a total reassessment. Okay, so Cap has left S.H.I.E.L.D. because of Hydra's infiltration, but he's so old now that he can't be the central conflict against Iron Man in Civil War. I don't want to see Tony beat up a senior citizen, do you? So Tony could still be for government oversight, and Captain America could be for more freedom, but who would be the main face of Cap's side? It would be interesting if it was Spider-Man. Spider-Man as a character usually loves freedom and working on his own for a bit, so with the altered timeline, I wonder if Spider-Man would be the poster hero for fighting on his own. I mean, the idea of seeing Iron Man and Spider-Man start off as ideological enemies before becoming friends is kind of appealing, right? It would also be interesting because the whole plot of Civil War right now hinges on Bucky, but if that's not the case, then what would be the driving force for the film? Just because I'm a little biased about wanting more Hulk stuff, what if Captain America isn't a stable presence in the group, and that causes Hulk to go on a bit of a rampage, and the idea of what to do with him causes a rift between heroes. That way you can have these two sides fighting for government oversight or not, while also paving the way for a Planet Hulk movie. That would be fun, right? Okay, we're in the end game now. How would Infinity War and Endgame be different if Steve Rogers wasn't involved? Well, working through the plot of Infinity War, really there's not a whole lot Steve could have done. It's Endgame where things get a little tricky. Steve couldn't be part of the time heist to get everything back, so depending on who's left standing after the snap, and basing it off of keeping everyone who snapped away still snapped away, then really the only option that could fill Steve's spot is Captain Marvel. They write Captain Marvel out of Endgame pretty quickly because she has to go protect the universe, but maybe Steve, being an old man and presumably having a more direct line with her due to his not being frozen over the years, means he can convince her to go on the mission. I mean, it's a pretty important mission, right? In Endgame, she says that Earth isn't a priority because she's protecting the entire universe, but if Steve asks her to go on a mission to save the entire universe, on top of being able to return basically the same moment they left, then that shouldn't be an issue. Captain Marvel on the mission makes everything a bit easier and would be an interesting side effect of Steve not being there because he's busy eating tapioca pudding or playing bingo or something. Steve Rogers is one of the most important characters in the first 3 phases of the MCU. His arc from a selfless hero to getting to pursue his own happy ending on his own terms is very fitting, and I think is arguably the better arc between him and Iron Man. Yeah, I said it, but he also impacts the story in such a unique way where taking him out of the equation and putting him in a different role changes everything about the story and the way things unfold. Do you think the MCU would still be as successful if they never froze Captain America and instead kept him as an old man running things from behind the scenes? I mean, I would have loved to see Chris Evans in old man makeup for long stretches of time, wouldn't you? And I also would love to see how his character would continue post-Endgame with the emergence of a new Captain America. Would Sam still take on the mantle? What would Steve and Sam's relationship be like if Isaiah Bradley was more involved in everyone's life? Just think about all those ramifications. There's so many different variations and ideas of how things would be different that it's enough to make your head spin. But that's the fun part of all these what ifs, don't you think? Do you think Howard and Steve would have formed as deep of a friendship as Tony and Steve did?
The Avengers roster always has room for more. Have you ever wondered what would happen in the MCU if the one and only Deadpool joined the team? Well, he probably draws his swords and makes it R-rated right away. Let's take a look and see what would happen if Deadpool fought the Avengers. There's an insanely large MCU roster of heroes at this point, and a lot of Avengers would fight Deadpool in similar ways. So let's break them up into categories, starting with what I call finesse. You may know this category as, yeah, they can jump around, kick, maybe shoot stuff, but if the Hulk ever punched them, they're probably one and done. This includes some of the best fighters like Yelena, Hawkeye, or Shang-Chi. Sure, they're all accompanied by weapons, but when it comes right down to it, you'll often find them using their fists. The fact of the matter is that even without his mutant abilities, Deadpool is one of the best hand-to-hand fighters in the universe. He could definitely beat the likes of people like Sam Wilson, both Hawkeyes and Yelena. He may have some difficulty with the likes of Taskmaster, Daredevil, and Gamora, and would almost definitely lose a Kumite if it included Shang-Chi.
Kumite.
If you take all the powers and weapons away, Deadpool is ranked pretty highly among fighters. Then obviously you have to add those powers and weapons back in. Deadpool's healing factor would allow him to defeat any precision fighter of the MCU. Any super spy, master archer, or blind butt kicker can punch or try to assassinate Wade Wilson all they want, and it won't matter because he almost instantly heals. They could cut his head off, and a severed hand will still find its way to it just so he can look at the camera and shush the audience in a post-credit scene of a movie so bad it never led to anything besides a run-on joke in a much more successful franchise. Sorry, 2009 really sucked for me. Some of these fighters do have powerful weapons. Sam's new Captain America getup or Hawkeye's trick arrows could definitely do some damage to the Merc. But do you think Shang-Chi's newest toys would make a difference? Based on what we've seen the 10 rings do, I don't see why Deadpool wouldn't be able to heal from their attacks. But I also think we've only scratched the surface. Who knows, maybe Shang-Chi holds the 10 keys to sewing Wade Wilson's mouth shut for good.
Stryker finally figured out how to shut you up.
All in all, I think if Deadpool went toe-to-toe with the greatest fighters in the MCU, he would not only hold his own, but you know he's bouncing back from anything they can dish out. However, if finesse can't get the job done, perhaps bigger muscles or a bigger brain is what it would take. From super soldiers to gamma-irradiated monsters, and even certain gods who would fall under the category of brute strength, Deadpool's tactics here would be a bit different. First, there's the obvious one. How do you think Deadpool fares against the Hulk? Well, truthfully, there's already a pretty comparable matchup out there. In Deadpool 2, Wade Wilson goes toe-to-toe with the Juggernaut, a being of equal size and strength to some of the best the MCU has to offer. It took only 2 seconds for the Juggernaut to rip Deadpool completely in half. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd probably tap out of the fight at that point. Deadpool, however, regrows his entire lower half, begging several different questions, but only one that really matters. Did Deadpool's missing lower half regrow its torso and head as well? Are there 2 Deadpools running around? Regardless, neither of them could probably fare well against the brute strength of the MCU. The Hulk would likely tear Deadpool in half again and again. He would just have to keep doing it every couple days or so. The same goes for Captain Marvel. Even though she may pack a harder punch and be a little more even-tempered, I think Deadpool bounces back. Granted, when Wade faced the Juggernaut, he was fangirling out a little bit and would probably be more focused since he's a much less big a fan of the Hulk. Super soldiers are another story, seeing as technically speaking, Deadpool's one too. He could maybe hold his own against the likes of John Walker, the Red Guardian, and Bucky, and eventually get lucky and take them out, but overall their strength outweighs his. People like Bucky also probably match skill level with Wade Wilson in terms of weapons proficiency. I don't think Deadpool's swords are busting through a metal arm or vibranium shield anytime soon. There's also people whose weapons could put them on the level of a super soldier, such as the famed armored heroes. War Machine is probably the shining remaining example in the MCU. Colonel Rhodes is definitely a smart guy, but you would have to classify his War Machine armor under the brute strength category. Unfortunately, it's to no avail. We've seen Wade purposely blow himself to pieces and still live to fight another day. However, one tougher class of being that Deadpool could fight would be the gods of the MCU. We're talking about Thor, Valkyrie, and the newly introduced Hercules. These are normal-looking people with the strength of beings like the Hulk, and weapons that could spell a little more trouble for the merc with a mouth. However, even with the might of Mjolnir, Stormbreaker, Zeus's Thunderbolt, or Hercules' Mace, I don't see why Deadpool couldn't heal from these kinds of attacks as well. Heck, even if Thor tries to do what he did to Loki and just put Mjolnir on Deadpool so he couldn't move, Wade could just cut a hole in his chest and regrow it. I don't think strength is the way to take down an immortal super soldier either, but don't worry, there may be a way. Bronze and finesse may be useful against the likes of Thanos or Steve Rogers, but some opponents just require an intelligent workaround. How do you think Deadpool does when he matches wits with the brains of the MCU? Wade Wilson's no moron. Well, I mean, he's not what you'd call book smart, but he's got a level of street smarts and a quick wit, at least to the level where he's not totally brain dead. He could get ripped apart and heal back together all day, but solutions in dealing with Wade may come from the smartest minds of the MCU. With who's left, this means the likes of Shuri, Riri Williams, Peter Parker, Bruce Banner out of the Hulk form, or a robot brain like the newly realized Vision. There have been intelligent ways to defeat Deadpool before. For example, we actually almost witnessed the death of our favorite mercenary in Deadpool 2. Granted, he's probably a little harder to fight when he doesn't spend the majority of the film trying to die. However, in this process, we saw a device in the form of a collar that actually suppresses mutant abilities. While wearing this, Wade was nearly killed just by the cancer that began regrowing in his body, instead of constantly healing. A bullet to the heart nearly finished the job while wearing this collar until someone decided to go in reverse time. Which kinda makes you wonder, why didn't Cable just wait until Wade fell unconscious and take the collar off, instead of wasting his last time jump? Oh well, he proved that it's possible to kill Deadpool. The remaining inventors of the MCU could definitely come up with something similar to the power dampening collar. Shuri has come up with a lot more impressive inventions than that, and Riri Williams may soon prove to have even more inventing prowess than anybody. Shuri has figured out how to depower the likes of Namor, so finding people's weaknesses is kind of her thing, and now Riri seems to be taking right after. The new Vision may have already downloaded everything there is to know about mutation, Deadpool's procedure, and Wade Wilson himself. Vision has the capability to know more about him than even Wade himself. Obviously, Vision is overly powerful, and can probably match strength with anyone in the brute strength category. But it's his incredible analytical mind, and the fact that he's literally a machine that helps him logic his way out of problems. The only one who can match wits with Vision is Vision. Lastly, you have the triple threat, Peter Parker. But even Tony saw Peter's potential in terms of his intelligence. Tony Stark isn't around anymore, so Deadpool's biggest fight could be against his prodigy. Whether he invents a solution or uses his insane teen strength, Peter has been a foil to Wade Wilson in the comics for years. There have been times where Spider-Man wins, but Deadpool has his fair share of victories as well. Truthfully, Peter can have the speed, brains, and brawn, but at the end of the day, I would think this one is a battle of popularity. Perhaps a straight-up brawl or a contest of wits isn't the best way to take down Deadpool. Whatever their best moves are, Deadpool can likely heal from it, and come back with some double-bladed vengeance. Would you see any of these heroes so far actually be able to take down Wade Wilson? Personally, I don't. Even a power dampening collar has to come off eventually. So who has that extra something, that special thing that could spell doom for Wade Wilson? Turns out there's quite a few. I'll tell you what the game changer could be. Magic. Doctor Strange, Wong, and the Scarlet Witch, who is definitely still alive, I don't care what you say, tend not to use their fists so much, but instead just extend their arms really powerfully at each other, and it probably looks really weird before the special effects are added. However, thanks to it, they are 3 of the most powerful magic users in the multiverse, and there has to be some spell out there that can circumvent Wade's healing ability. Mere guns and swords likely can't touch them, or they probably would have been taken down a long time ago. Plus, at this point, Doctor Strange could just get America Chavez to trap Deadpool in the dimension made entirely out of paint. You know though, those are the obvious ones. There's some other characters who may just possess that something extra. Characters who can fight or use their mind, but just may have tapped into something supernatural that could take down an instantly healing martial artist with quite the mouth on him. Take Moon Knight for example. Yeah, he mostly punches people, but being backed by the magic of Khonshu has given him the same sort of healing ability as Wade himself. Mark Spector takes full spears directly through the midsection and walks away okay thanks to the Egyptian god of the moon. If Khonshu has the ability to give that power to someone, perhaps he could help Moon Knight overcome it in someone else. There's also Kamala Khan, whose newfound connection to another dimension may give her an unknown ability that renders Deadpool's healing useless. She's probably the most blank slate the MCU has, given the liberty that they seem to be taking with her powers. For all we know, she could come out with a Deadpool antidote power. I wouldn't put it past them. Loki is another dabbler in the mystic arts who currently comes nowhere close to the likes of the Sorcerer Supreme. Though if we take a look at an older version of him from another universe, he could just surprise you. He also currently has access to time knowledge that almost no other hero does. And yes, sorry Loki fans, the dude's a hero, whether you like it or not. If Bucky can assassinate people for decades and still be a hero, I think Loki is pretty redeemed. His new TVA connections combined with his newfound confidence in seeing his potential could give him an edge. That and the fact that other than Wade, Loki is probably the most mischievous character there is. Lastly, there's the secret weapon. Deadpool's perhaps greatest strength is his awareness. It supersedes cosmic awareness. Instead, Deadpool's ability to break the fourth wall potentially makes him more powerful than anyone, except the one person in the MCU who has shown proficiency in this already. She-Hulk, even though it was kind of a lazy joke, was able to rewrite the entire ending of her own show. With this power, she could defeat anyone, be it Thanos, Kang, or even Deadpool. Wade could theoretically do this too. She-Hulk can punch anyone's face in, but this battle may be won over whose fourth wall resources are better put to use. Supposedly, She-Hulk's access to Kevin has been turned off, but I assume Deadpool could still crawl all over the Disney Plus menu. There have been a lot of good points brought up, and it looks like Deadpool might actually have his hands full with some of these heroes, don't you think? Wrong, fool. How could you think anyone could beat Deadpool? Forget your facts, throw logic out the window. The thing is, if Deadpool fought the Avengers, he's beating everyone. Don't believe me? Look no further than the comics. Specifically, Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe. In this story, Wade Wilson takes on literally everyone. He goes from hero to hero and villain to villain and kills them all. Even the unkillable ones. He forces Taskmaster to kill himself with his own sword by copying Wade. He kills Wolverine by exploiting the fact that his immortality comes from his popularity, not his healing. Wade goes on this universe-wide killing spree because he finally officially realizes he is in a comic book. And it ends with him killing the most powerful people in the Marvel Universe, the very people who create it. He enters the real world and kills the people writing him into existence.
Focus up, ladies. Good evening, and welcome to the birthing suite.
Did you ever wonder what would happen if Iron Man came back to the MCU?
It's good to be back.
Well, we've been thinking about it, and would it be good or bad? What would it mean? Let's discuss it in this video.
All right, I think we got this. Send them off.
We'll start off by kind of revisiting what Iron Man's role has been in the MCU so far. Like, how important was he as a character? If we attempt to answer this question, we kind of already know the answer, but let's just have a little bit of a recap to really establish the importance of his role in the MCU. So Iron Man has been a long-time hero, since way before the Avengers even came into play. He showed up in the movies as early as Spider-Man and Hulk way back in 2008, and ever since then, it has only been Robert Downey Jr. playing him, aside from all the animations which may or may not be canon. Come to think of it, isn't he actually one of the older Marvel characters that hasn't been recast yet? Unless I'm missing someone really important. Anyways, after the Avengers, Iron Man's role was not only in his solo films as he played a major leader, tactician, strategist, and comedian of the team of heroes. His wit did make us chuckle every now and then. His last solo film was back in 2013, and then in 2019 with Endgame, the Iron Man legacy came to an end.
Iron Man.
It wasn't entirely an end though, because Iron Man is still present and part of the MCU. In Spider-Man Far From Home, we are reminded again of Tony Stark's genius and the impact Iron Man had in Spider-Man's life in general.
I just wanted to be like you.
And I wanted you to be better.
He was like a father figure to the guy who never had an opportunity to have a role model. Not to mention, Iron Man was the one with the most global reach as well. Because of his role as an entrepreneur, there was nothing this guy couldn't do. There really is no lack of role for this man. He is the face of the Avengers. And his death in Endgame was something that shocked audiences and made the movie really memorable to watch. Now everyone remembers the movie where Iron Man died. So, which upcoming movies or TV shows have the potential to reintroduce Iron Man? Or at least let him appear as a cameo? Well, with the Phase 5 and Phase 6 repertoire introduced, there are a few places where Iron Man could possibly make a cameo, and the first one we would like to talk about is Ironheart. Now, we already know that Riri Williams is heavily inspired by Iron Man, so much so that her AI conscience is literally Tony Stark. Now that AI being not Tony could give room for Iron Man to at least make a cameo, which honestly would make sense and wouldn't be so bad if done right, but they could also just have that role played by a not RDJ. However, interestingly, Ironheart is also one of the most expensive Marvel TV shows. That gives us an inkling that maybe not all the budget went into the visual effects, but also to pay certain actors for their time and work? Well, that's just speculation for now, as nothing has been confirmed about that. But maybe. Oh, before I forget, please like and subscribe. I need to make my parents proud somehow. Okay, anyways, we'll talk about the comics here for a bit and the relationship between Ironheart and Iron Man. Contrary to what happened in the MCU, in the comics, Iron Man is actually in a coma after the events of Civil War II. And in Invincible Iron Man #1, it is revealed that Iron Man had actually uploaded his consciousness in an AI form into Riri Williams' suit. If the comics are any hint at what's coming, this could mean that possibly Iron Man could return in Ironheart as an AI consciousness who assists Riri Williams. If we remember in Black Panther Wakanda Forever, Riri is seen working on a suit that is quite similar to Tony Stark's very first on-screen suit of armor in one of his earliest solo films. We know that Riri isn't nearly as rich as Tony to be able to acquire parts so valuable, and in the comics she is allowed to get those parts from Stark Industries or by borrowing from MIT. But in the MCU that we know, Iron Man and Ironheart haven't even met yet. We will again put this little speculation out there, that perhaps they already have. Because in 2022 during an interview, the director for Black Panther Wakanda Forever had already told us that Iron Man and Ironheart will have a complicated connection. Yes, okay, but how? When they haven't even met? We just think that it is quite possible that they already have met, and it is also a possibility that Mr. Stark prepared some countermeasures before the events of Endgame. It would make sense if he did, and it wouldn't be odd for such a genius to have done something like that, but we know that Marvel does tend to deviate from the comics quite a bit. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens with this one. Another potential appearance we mentioned earlier was Armor Wars. Now, the basic premise of Armor Wars in the comics is that Stark's inventions fall into the wrong hands, so he sets out to make things right by defeating those who have been using his inventions to cause harm. Some of these enemies include Beetle, Doctor Doom, Stiltman, Shockwave, Mauler, and many others. Stark technology was stolen and leaked by Justin Hammer as he hired Spymaster to do the job, and it was something that Iron Man feared, his inventions falling into the wrong hands. Now, this whole arc is an Iron Man arc, but we don't have Iron Man in the MCU anymore, so presumably War Machine is going to do what Iron Man would have done. And this could spell out for a bit of an emotional story with James Rhodey protecting the legacy of a friend who passed away. We believe that there might be a cameo in this case, either through a flashback or some kind of message left behind by Iron Man, which could potentially be delivered either by Riri Williams or some pre-planned message left behind by him in one of his inventions, or, you know, just as a note. Yeah, that would be underwhelming, but it could be as simple as a note, I'm just saying.
Let's face it, this is not the worst thing you've caught me doing.
Okay, so for the last one we have Secret Wars. Now this one is a bit interesting because there was a Secret Wars arc written in 1984 and one written in 2015. We are going to be focusing more on the one from 2015 as the Secret Wars movie is being hyped up to be something huge, and we believe several heroes will return for their role in the film, and that includes Iron Man. The Secret Wars arc from 2015 ties in much closely with the current MCU narrative where the multiverse has come into play. And in this comic series, the multiple universes sort of collide to become this one universe called the Battle World. where all these heroes from different universes come together and even fight each other. So for this one, it would really make sense that Iron Man, one of the faces of the Avengers and Marvel in general, would reappear in another role, especially since this would more or less become the conclusion of the multiverse saga. There are also some sneaky sources that have confirmed Iron Man's return in Armor Wars and Secret Wars in particular, but you know, there's a lot of similar rumors like that around for the hype, so we wouldn't give it too much of a thought, but just an honorable mention in case things do come into play like that. There are also more canon rumors regarding Iron Man's reappearance, such as the response by Mark Ruffalo stating that, "I'm not going to say it's not possible, but I'm not going to say it is." And it makes sense because the multiverse and time travel aspects could easily make it happen, but there is also the little comment where RDJ himself once said that he believes that the role is done. It's really on the fence, and anything could happen.
If I tell you what happens, it won't happen.
But then again, we also got this really firm refusal that Iron Man's just off the table, as Steven Broussard, the Vice President of Production and Development at Marvel, states that after these first 10 years of Marvel storytelling, torches are being passed, like with Robert Downey Jr. no longer being on the table and stuff like that. So it was kind of like a new generation stepping to the forefront, which again has always happened in the comics, he said. Well, okay, if you say so, Mr. Broussard, but we aren't going to fall for all this misdirection. We all know what's really going on here. So let's just start off by saying that mostly, bringing Iron Man back would be a bad idea. Now wait a minute, before you reach for that keyboard. He is definitely one of the most beloved characters of many, and there are probably those in the audience who will be excited by his appearance just because they could see him again. But would it be a good plot inclusion by Marvel? Most likely not. And there are a couple reasons for this. The first one being that Iron Man is done. We all saw him die, and that was an emotional moment for us, and then if you just bring him back, then why did I waste all of those days crying and depressed over his death? I'm okay. In an interview with Joe Rogan, Robert Downey Jr. was even hesitant to return as Iron Man. "It's scary," he said. And we agree. The response from the audience would be a very scary thing to anticipate, and by now it's difficult to imagine an Iron Man other than RDJ. It isn't impossible for him to be recast and a new Iron Man to be introduced because of the multiverse aspect, but it would definitely be strange and could be met with backlash. It would really be a risky move for Iron Man to be brought back so soon too, especially since it has only been about 3 years since he took the exit from the MCU. So you can't even bet on the nostalgia factor as a catalyst to bring back his reappearance in a way that would be positively received. Aside from the potentially negative backlash, you can also already see that the creators at Marvel are trying to move on from the older heroes to more of the newer ones, which is actually more exciting than seeing those same handful of heroes over and over again. I mean, think about all those heroes we haven't seen yet because of the focus on the more popular ones. We could have Sentry, who is literally Marvel's version of Superman, or Nova, our favorite space cop, or Omega the Unknown, who has been forgotten how many times over the years? There is an endless array of really cool characters and storylines yet to be introduced, and we already know a lot about the current MCU characters. They are widely popular and their story has already been told and is actually sort of running out. Well, not exactly, but you know what I mean. Most of the characters have already been going into retirement because even they are getting tired of representing themselves. Now as fans, we really love seeing some of the same characters take the screen once a year, and the next year. But if it keeps happening every year, Spider-Man Part 100, all at home? Get it? Because no one is showing up at the theater? But that's why we have all these new characters, Ironheart, Echo, She-Hulk, Moon Knight, and many others who are still in line for the screen. Yes, most of them are females, but we would love to see something other than what we already have, and it would be a good move from Marvel to grow an audience for these characters as long as it's done properly. The beloved characters that we already have are great. They have amassed a fan base for years, but there are still some that we wish we could see, and even though some of us might still show up to see Spider-Man 100, there will still be those who would get tired of it. And to stop these characters in the franchise from going stale, we are already seeing changes being made. However, in this multiverse of madness, if Iron Man were to reappear, what would that mean for the MCU? For starters, we can expect that Spider-Man could get some closure, as the hero has already lost a lot in No Way Home. Perhaps a moment of guidance from Iron Man and a goodbye that was left unsaid. Or as a mentor for Riri Williams, who seems to be taking the mantle as a new individual version of Iron Man, like a montage of bonding between the two as a hero and his successor. Perhaps a moment of comedic relief where he takes over Stark Industries again, and possibly a wholesome moment where he reunites with his family once again. There are many possibilities and more than 30 different armors unaccounted for which could just appear in Armor Wars, but with his reappearance maybe we could see even more armors and inventions. But what would Iron Man's reinstatement in the franchise serve in the grand scheme of things? We can only assume that this could entail the Avengers reassembling once again, perhaps for a final battle, or just more fights with Iron Man's leadership. But would that be a good idea? It really depends on how the concept is executed, and it really all comes down to the plans at Marvel HQ. But all in all, his appearance really isn't exactly necessary. The MCU has been continuing without Iron Man so far. Well, we still have his gadgets around, but for him to physically return isn't something that needs to be focused on at this point in time, where the MCU clearly needs a new direction to go towards. If we really think about it, what would be stopping the creators at Marvel to be holding back on an Iron Man reappearance?
Why don't we just do things our own way?
Well, first and foremost, it's the aspect of the negative backlash from the audience. Why would they be happy about a character reappearing when he died only just recently? It kinda defeats the point of killing him in the first place, doesn't it? And if we add on to this, what purpose would this reappearance really serve? The MCU seems to be doing just fine without him, and it's honestly a bit interesting to see how the remaining and newer heroes are going to deal with future enemies without Iron Man's help, since he was one of the pack of leaders devising intricate plans, inventions, and strategies to take down enemies. Plus, even the creators might be done with Iron Man for a good long time, and it would actually be a reasonable decision as new heroes need to be introduced. The narrative has to change into something different or else it would become stale with its repetitive nature and ultimately meet the end of a franchise. They have to keep it alive somehow, don't they? So that concludes this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below on your feelings about Iron Man returning. Would it really be a good idea? Should they do it so soon? Well anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.
Although I like that the MCU has moved past Iron Man being the center of everything, I can't help but wonder what would the MCU look like if Tony was still alive? How different would Phase 4 look? Where could his character go if he in fact survived Endgame? How would future projects like Secret Wars be impacted if Tony Stark was involved in them? There's a lot of questions that I'm so excited to talk about today. Spider-Man's arc, the Illuminati, Superior Iron Man, I'm discussing them all, so let's get started right now. Tony Stark was the face of the MCU. No matter how much the franchise was expanding, everything always seemed to go back to the man who kickstarted it all. And for good reason. Robert Downey Jr. was magnetic as the genius billionaire playboy philanthropist and was just so much gosh darn fun to watch. I'm sure we all could have watched him in 50 more movies. Sure, by the time Iron Man 50 came along, I'm sure RDJ would be raking in $1 trillion paycheck, so let's scale it back a bit. Let's talk about Iron Man 4. Off the bat, this seems like the biggest no-brainer answer to the question of what if Iron Man survived the snap. He was the most popular MCU character, and whatever movie he was in tended to make $1 billion. So if Tony did survive, then I wouldn't have been surprised if Iron Man 4 either opened Phase 4 or served as its ending. But the question is, what would the plot actually be? Let's start off big and bold. Let's say that Tony fully recovered after the snap because he was wearing a specialty vibranium suit that allowed him to absorb the impact of the Infinity Gauntlet without causing serious damage or something, and he was back to his Iron Man ways for Iron Man 4. What would that story lead to? Well, the way I see it, he would have a similar arc to Thor post-Endgame. Tony's whole personality after the first Avengers movie was preparing for the big one, aka Thanos. And now that he saved the day, what would he focus on? Well, Iron Man 4 would be about establishing a new mission for himself. Sorry, Rhodey, but I think Armor Wars would be better suited for this movie. Having a plotline where Tony's tech falls into his enemy's hands and Tony facing the consequences for it would set up a great next chapter for the character. Then you can make Tony face villains like Crimson Dynamo or Titanium Man, and then he would realize that maybe the tech he invents is better off in nobody's hands and then retires. You know, so they could redo the Iron Man 3 ending, only this time have it stick. Anyways, overall, seeing the consequences could pivot Tony away from the suit and into a new role, and the movie could end with him becoming the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Tony Stark as the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. solves a few problems. It minimizes RDJ's role in the MCU so that other heroes have a chance to shine, and opens up a whole new character arc for Tony. It allows him to be involved without always being the center of attention, which I know is hard for Tony. I also get in the real world why this would be difficult. RDJ was able to keep negotiating massive paychecks for himself so that for Endgame he earned $75 million. I'm sure at that point Disney kept checking all their mountains of gold and planned for a way to stop paying RDJ's increasingly monstrous salary. So if Tony Stark did continue on in the MCU in a supporting role, RDJ would have to agree to a massive pay cut. But let's pretend that wasn't even an issue. Putting Tony Stark in a new leadership type of role would be a great way to push the character to new heights. Because as central as Tony was to the Avengers, it was clear he was never the leader. Sure, he had his opinions, but Captain America was always the one fully leading the team. What would Tony be like when he can't just make sarcastic comments? We never even really saw Tony leading Stark Industries since he signed that over to Pepper quite quickly, so that he could have fun tinkering in his lab and fighting bad guys. Putting him as the director allows him to have a hand in global security, which is clearly something he likes, but also puts some checks and balances and rules on him that he wouldn't be used to. But if we're being honest, maybe rules and structure would be good for Tony. I don't know how much you have to bend over backwards to make Tony the S.H.I.E.L.D. director in the MCU, given that he literally has no experience in that field, but hey, I think it's okay when it would lead to such a great new character direction. So the first two entries were about where Iron Man's story would go, but now let me take a minute to discuss how his survival in Endgame would affect those around him. Obviously, the biggest question is what would happen to Spider-Man. Tony and Peter's relationship was one of the purest in the MCU, and it was a clear case of mentor-mentee where each could learn from each other. I mean, looking at Endgame, Tony was hesitant to even try the whole time travel plan until he was reminded of Peter and thought he could save him. Obviously, the two have a special bond, and it would make Spider-Man Far From Home completely different if Tony was alive. Honestly, Spider-Man's arc in Far From Home is probably the best argument against keeping Tony alive. Far From Home pushed Peter in a new direction. He had to learn that he wasn't just supposed to be the next Iron Man, but rather he was supposed to be his own hero, which was a nice moment of growth after introducing Spider-Man as basically Iron Man Jr. in the MCU. But then again, if Tony was still alive, then maybe Mysterio's origin would change. Maybe he wouldn't have been just another disgruntled Stark employee who hates Tony Stark, but rather the MCU could have made him solely a Spider-Man villain that he has to face on his own. Then we wouldn't have to make jokes about how Peter again had to fight a villain who just actually hated Iron Man. So I think there was a way to make this work by hitting the same beats as Far From Home, but change it enough to have Tony still alive. Maybe Tony's role could be minimal and we could work in what I already said about Iron Man 4. Maybe Tony seeing that Peter is more than capable of being his own hero without Tony's help could push Tony to take a step back from the superhero life and more into that S.H.I.E.L.D. director role. Alright, so I've been singing the praises of Tony Stark this whole time, but let's be real. If he was still alive, then chances are he'd still be making very questionable decisions. I think that's Tony Stark's greatest superpower. He can make really bad decisions, but we still love the guy almost unconditionally. I mean, by all accounts, even after he turned into a good guy, he was a horrible employer who didn't think how his actions affected those lower than him. Like, he thought he was helping with damage control in Homecoming, but it ended up pushing out the blue-collar workers like Adrian Toomes. And yes, you could argue that Quentin Beck was actually quite unstable, but the fact that a huge chunk of Stark Industries employees sided with Beck makes you think that they had a reason to hate Tony. Then there's the whole thing of creating Ultron, then arguably choosing the wrong side in Civil War, even though you understood where he was coming from. So by all accounts, given his history, Tony would make more bad decisions, and I would love to see what those would be. Here's my biggest one. You know how I mentioned Armor Wars being the basis for Iron Man 4? Well, maybe a side effect of that is having some of Tony's tech winding up in Latveria, and then Tony would have inadvertently helped future big bad Dr. Doom. What other bad decisions would he make? One of the best things about wondering what would happen if Tony Stark survived the snap is trying to figure out how he would fit into all the future plans. Let's start with Kang the Conqueror. How would someone like Kang affect Tony's psyche? He's always been obsessed with the idea of Thanos coming in and wiping out Earth, but now what happens when there's a new villain trying to conquer the multiverse? I wonder, if Tony Stark was alive, if they would highlight Kang's more technical abilities. In the comics, Kang is a super advanced scientist with a super powered suit, and they could draw parallels parallels between Kang and Tony in the suit department. But in that case, you would kind of take focus away from the great connection between Kang and Mr. Fantastic. I think for the Kang dynasty, you would have Tony be that supporting player that I've been talking about earlier. Maybe the snap actually slowly affected Tony in such a way where he's too injured to ever wear the suit again, so he has to be his normal human self leading S.H.I.E.L.D. or whatever while the other heroes fight on the front lines. This would be the biggest threat that the multiverse would ever face, and Tony has to take a back seat to it, and that would be a fun new character development. Okay, this is a fun one. I think if Tony Stark survived the snap, then we would have a better option for Superior Iron Man, which in the comics is an evil alternate universe version of Iron Man. I think if our Tony were still alive, then it would be easier to introduce an evil RDJ in a different universe. Heck, there's already a perfect place for him. In Multiverse of Madness, Earth 838 basically got wrecked with all their top heroes horribly destroyed thanks to an alternate universe threat. What if that universe's version of Tony Stark sees this destruction and then decides to wipe out all other universes in order to protect Earth 838? That would be a great way to build off the events of Multiverse of Madness and establish a new multiversal threat of a Superior Iron Man. Plus, getting to play an evil version of himself might be an acting challenge that RDJ would like and convince him to stick around in the MCU for a few more years. That brings me to Secret Wars. If I wasn't convinced that Doom will be the big bad of Secret Wars, then you could make the case that evil Tony Stark would be a great replacement. Think about it. Evil Tony Stark would be a villain we are somewhat familiar with. It would show us a version of the character that presumably never had a change of heart. It would highlight how great our Tony is and keep our version of Iron Man front and center as they battle this threat. And all that really only works if our Tony is still alive after the snap. Yes, that would rob us of Doom, but I don't really see all these characters working in the same movie. We have to pick one or the other, and as much as Doom-centric Secret Wars would be amazing, I can't help but think how great an evil Tony Stark-centric Secret Wars would totally rule. I think if Tony Stark survived the snap and he wasn't the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D., then he would definitely form the Illuminati, a group of the world's top minds meeting in secret to decide how to handle certain dangerous threats. Seems like the most Tony Stark-esque reaction to the events of Endgame. Tony Stark always worked to prevent catastrophic events, and after Thanos, he would want to make sure nothing like that could happen again. So he would let new Captain America lead the Avengers, but then in the shadows lead his own group of the world's brightest minds in order to solve problems. I could see him recruiting Bruce Banner, Reed Richards, Captain Marvel, Doctor Strange, the new Black Panther, and probably Professor X when he shows up. Would this ultimately be a good Tony decision or a bad Tony decision? I'm going to take a few short entries to talk about how most of the Phase 4 movies would probably be affected if Tony survived the snap. Let's start with the movie that kicked off Phase 4, Black Widow. If Tony survived the snap, then Black Widow would have been the only major casualty in Endgame. So would her movie carry more weight to it? I'm not saying her sacrifice wasn't important, but Endgame and the MCU seems to only be highlighting Tony Stark's sacrifice and not Black Widow's. Other than that, I think we probably could have gotten a Tony Stark cameo in Black Widow, right? Out of all the Phase 4 movies, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is arguably the one Tony could be most involved in. After all, it does include the Ten Rings, which is the terrorist organization that kidnaps Tony in the first Iron Man, and features the Mandarin as the main villain, which is arguably Tony's biggest and best villain in the comics. I wouldn't change Shang-Chi's story at all, because actually that's one of my favorite Phase 4 projects, but I do think you could have featured Iron Man in the film in a small supporting role to tie in to his comic history and the overall MCU involvement with the Ten Rings. I mean, if they could give Trevor Slattery a sizable supporting role, they could have fit in Tony Stark, that's all I'm saying. Tony Stark would definitely be concerned that there's a giant celestial now sticking out of the Earth. I feel like nobody's taking that seriously. Earth's whole existence was just confirmed to be nothing more than an egg in the larger scheme of things, so the Celestials and the Eternals would be a major plot point that Tony would definitely want to learn more about. In fact, the Eternals I think would open up Tony's mind to the cosmos a bit more and probably lead him to working with Nick Fury to build that protective sword station in space. Even if Far From Home's arc is altered to have Tony take a backseat in Peter's life, Tony would still have to play a part in No Way Home. If Peter's identity is revealed and it causes him to not be accepted into MIT, then you would think Tony would just call up his alma mater and tell them to get over it and donate $1 billion. So then, would Peter really have a reason to erase everyone's memory? Well, I think there's a way around this. What if Peter's identity reveal actually negatively impacts Tony's reputation? Like, the whole world would know that Tony basically recruited a 15-year-old to fight evil, and that would skew public opinion against Iron Man. Peter, being grateful of everything Tony has done, could continue on with his plan of erasing everyone's memories. And as heartbreaking as the ending is with MJ and Ned not remembering Peter, imagine a scene where Tony no longer remembers who Peter Parker is? Heartbreaking. She-Hulk is proving to be more of a straightforward comedy with excellent cameos, and I think it's something Tony Stark would work well in. Imagine if there were a court case actually about a disgruntled Stark employee suing Tony. That would be a fun way to highlight what a horrible boss Tony is and comment on all the previous employees who have done it in the past. Tony's survival doesn't necessarily need to be for dramatic purposes. There could be some fun ones too. And Tony has never been in a straight comedy before, but it's something he's clearly suited for. But of course, it's something he needs to be alive for, right? Obviously, the relationship between Iron Man and Captain America was a highlight in the first 3 phases, which is why I want to see what Tony's working relationship with Sam Wilson would be now, especially if Tony is the S.H.I.E.L.D. director. Then he would presumably work closely with Captain America, right? Would the two have the same sort of working respect for each other, but also strong opposing ideals like Tony and Steve? Or would the two find a better way to work together? And that relationship could be explored in depth, since Captain America New World Order seems like a perfect first movie for both the new Captain America and this new version of Tony Stark. As of now, I'm very curious how they'll do Ironheart in the MCU. In the comics, Riri Williams is the mentee of Tony Stark, and their relationship is an interesting one that right now we'll never see come to life. If Tony was still alive, he could mentor Riri and have things be a bit more comic accurate. Plus, remember what I said a few entries ago? If No Way Home happens where Tony forgets who Peter Parker is, imagine the drama that could come with Peter seeing Tony take on a new protege. That would also solve the problem of them just rehashing the Peter and Tony storyline. I think Tony's survival of the snap opens up a ton of possibilities, and establishing a new mentee-mentor role with Ironheart would be one of its biggest positives. I mean, at the very least, could we get a Tony Stark voiced AI for Riri's suit, please?
Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, is among the most recognizable weapons in all of comic book history. But what if Mjolnir was created out of a completely different material? Like, I don't know, adamantium?
Oh, please be my guest.
That would be insane, right, Iron Man? Right? Right?
Mother, I can explain.
In the Marvel comic, Iron Man number 25, Mjolnir has gone missing. That doesn't bode well for the God of Thunder, but Tony Stark believes he has a solution to the problem, because what billionaire, genius, playboy, philanthropist wouldn't? Tony finds Thor in Jotunheim after discovering Thor's distress call. Upon arriving and finding Thor, Iron Man and the rest of us learn that Mjolnir has gone missing. Instead of going on a whodunit mystery adventure, Tony offers up a logical solution. Like any sane person, he recommends that they melt down Wolverine's adamantium bones and make a new hammer. I'm sorry, does Iron Man not know who Wolverine is?
Tell me his name again.
Knowing Iron Man, he was probably being witty, but he does offer the solution of melting down Wolverine's adamantium bones, add in a little vibranium, and steal some material from Reed Richards' lab. Sounds like making Mjolnir out of adamantium would be like baking a cake when it's proposed in that fashion. Smelting this kind of weapon would make this new Mjolnir similar to Captain America's shield, which is made out of similar elements called proto-adamantium. We all know how powerful Cap's shield is, as it is utilized as both an offensive and defensive weapon, so we can only imagine what Mjolnir could do in the hands of Thor if it were made out of similar material. At the end of the day, Thor declines the offer to try and melt down Wolverine, which is probably the smart and safer choice. It's also the best decision if you like where your limbs currently are, you know, attached to your torso. Would this even be a good idea for the God of Thunder? Well, like anyone that faces a major decision, it's time to make a good old-fashioned pros and cons list.
I'll put it on the list.
It's the only logical solution to this hypothetical problem. Where should we start? Pros first? I agree. The good news should always come first, and if you don't agree with that, then I guess that's fine. The first and best pro is that it would be new and shiny. If Thor is anything like us regular people, our brains get all tickled over new and shiny things. Thor does have a history of loving his vices, and new toys are a vice for most of us. The hammer would twinkle and glisten right before knocking the enemy's teeth out. New stuff is the best stuff, and sure, Thor would be sad that the OG Mjolnir is gone, but if corporate America has taught me anything, it's that anyone, and in this case anything, is replaceable. Thor very quickly replaced Mjolnir with Stormbreaker in the MCU, and sure, that was more out of absolute necessity, but wasn't it established that he didn't need his hammer to channel his powers? One could argue that Thor was simply itching to stimulate the reward section of his brain. Such a primitive god. The second pro would be, what if Thor found the OG Mjolnir while in possession of the Adamantium Mjolnir? Could you imagine Thor literally dual-wielding Mjolnirs? The ruthless combinations that he could land on his enemies would be like watching a masterclass in Tekken. Never let your opponent touch the ground, Thor. I can see him smashing the two hammers together to create a violent spark of electricity that would temporarily blind and deafen his opponent like an ungodly flashbang. He could even toss the enemy the enchanted Mjolnir so that when they catch it, they would instantly fall to the ground, and the Adamantium Mjolnir could crush them. The little switcheroos would be hilarious, and the new creative ways Thor would dispose of his enemies would be something to see. How do you think a dual-wielding Thor would approach combat? I mean, the possibilities are endless. The third and final pro to the Adamantium Mjolnir would depend on which form of adamantium we are discussing. If Iron Man was able to recreate proto-adamantium, which has been impossible so far and all attempts have only produced what is called primary adamantium, then it would be a no-brainer that Adamantium Mjolnir would be an upgrade. Thor would be tossing the OG Mjolnir back to Captain America in return for Adamantium Mjolnir. However, Wolverine's Adamantium is not proto-adamantium, and while it is strong, it just isn't as strong as the prototype. No pun intended. Alright, now what would be the cons to an Adamantium Mjolnir? What is the first thing that comes to mind for you? Anything? Bueller? Odin's enchantment wouldn't be on it, obviously. Arguably, anyone strong enough to lift the hammer based on weight and strength alone would be able to do so. It wouldn't matter if they were worthy or not in spirit, and the hammer could easily fall into the wrong hands if Thor were to lose it, which, due to us even having this conversation, is a distinct possibility. Come on, Thor. Do a pocket check before you leave Asgard so this doesn't happen again. Phone, wallet, keys, Mjolnir. Boom. Now you can go on saving the world or whatever. The next con would be, well, getting the adamantium off of Wolverine's bones. Yeah, I'm not sure how well that'll work out, folks. Unless you were able to get Magneto to rip it out through his pores, which has happened.
I know the smell of your adamantium from a mile away.
Then I don't see how anyone would subdue him long enough to remove his entire skeleton. That would also be extremely messy, and I'm not sure Iron Man has the stomach for that level of brutality. A final downside to this scenario is that adamantium just isn't as strong as the original material that Mjolnir is made out of. Adamantium might be the strongest metal on Earth, but Mjolnir isn't from Earth. Mjolnir is made from a nugget of Uru with a cosmic storm trapped inside. But we will get into the history of Mjolnir more in a bit. Under the right circumstances, the OG Mjolnir could break adamantium. For example, in Avengers Volume 3, number 63, Thor put a dent in Captain America's shield while his hammer was powered by the Odin Force. Now, Cap's shield is made out of an adamantium that is stronger than Wolverine's bones, and you could give credit to the Odin Force for the dent in the shield, but the mere fact that there are scenarios that can amplify Mjolnir enough to damage Captain America's shield means that with enough power or consecutive strikes, OG Mjolnir would be the superior weapon. And now, in order to understand what Mjolnir could be, you need to understand what Mjolnir is. Crack open an Asgardian ale, try not to pass out, and browse through a history of Mjolnir. Mjolnir is made out of Uru, which is a metal from the first moon in existence, so yeah, it's pretty ancient. It was forged using the heat of a dying star and has a strong affinity to magic. So that means not only can it be imbued with different magics and enchantments, but it can also harness magic. It even grows stronger the more magic it is around. If Thor can put Mjolnir in the way of a direct energy blast, that energy can be harnessed and launched back at the enemy. As previously mentioned, a cosmic storm was trapped inside this chunk of Uru before it was forged in Nidavellir. The storm was called the God Tempest and approached Asgard, which led to Odin battling the storm for many, many days to defend Asgard. The storm was raining a lot more than cats and dogs, I'll tell you that. Finally, when the storm was at its weakest, Odin was able to trap it inside his chunk of Uru like a genie. It took 17 weeks for the Uru to be hot enough to manipulate, and the star power they were harnessing exploded under the stress. It took a little while for Mjolnir to be controlled by anyone since the God Tempest was still alive inside. The hammer wreaked havoc on Asgard as it flew out of control until Odin locked it away in the armory for, well, a really, really long time. Finally, the God Tempest essentially died, but the hammer retained its mighty power. Odin placed the worthiness enchantment on the hammer, but did you know that the enchantment is so strong that it still works even if Mjolnir were to be cut in half? Thor also has the ability to grant temporary worthiness to anyone he sees fit to wield the hammer. Odin, being the person who casted the enchantment, can also change who can wield the hammer and can make it so that even Thor himself would not be able to pick it up, which is what we saw happen in the original Thor movie, but we all know how that ends up already. Mjolnir is a loyal weapon to its user. They share a strong link that allows the user to call for Mjolnir wherever they may be, even if an entire planet is in the way.
Every time I threw it, it would always come back to me.
If the connection is strong enough, that wouldn't be an issue. I would let a push door that I pulled on stop me from entering a building. So imagine the determination Mjolnir must have to blast through a planet to reach its destination. Lastly, the true Mjolnir gives a variety of pretty sick abilities to whoever wields it. Abilities such as weather manipulation, flight, energy projection, energy sensing, teleportation, and the ability to communicate with any and all races. There are several more, but those are some of the more prominent abilities worth making note of. Obviously, the idea of taking adamantium straight off of Wolverine's bones is criminally insane, but the greater the risk, the greater the reward, you know what I mean? Do you think there would be more pros or cons to an adamantium Mjolnir? Would the God of Thunder be just as intimidating without his original hammer made out of Uru? Let us know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching. And thank